Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to ESG Talks, a KBRA podcast series focusing on environmental, social, and governance, ESG. This podcast series highlights various ESG hot topics and includes commentary from prominent voices within the ESG community. In this episode, I chat with Gordon Kerr, KBRA's head of European research and host of KBRA's Conversations in European Credit podcast. Gordon and I chat about the most recent Conference of the Parties, COP28. This year's event took place in Dubai and ran from the 30th of November through the 12th of December. We highlight key takeaways from the proceedings, including fossil fuel interests at the event, discussions around carbon capture and storage, and divisions over the language of the final text. Hello to all of our listeners. This is Emilie Nadler, a director on KBRA's ESG team. Thanks for joining me today, Gordon, to discuss all of the interesting happenings at COP28. Kind of just taking a step back, the event took place at a pretty tumultuous time with conflict persisting in Gaza and Ukraine and continued global economic challenges. The United Arab Emirates, a top oil-producing country, was the host this year, and Sultan Ahmed Al-Jaber served as COP28's president. Sultan Al-Jaber was also the special envoy for climate change for the UAE and is the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. So past COPs have been criticized for the presence of oil interests, and this year was no different, but it was really particularly ramped up because of the event's location and its chosen president. Climate activists also said at this year's event that they felt their participation in COP continues to diminish every year while the fossil fuel industry's presence is growing.
Yeah, Emily, thanks for having me on. It was a very interesting COP because, as you mentioned, global conflict and economic conditions, but also the conversations around fossil fuel use and how it will play into the climate transition. In his opening statements, President Al-Jaber made the case for the role of oil and gas, of course, saying that the global energy transition can be led by fossil fuel companies through technological advancement and innovation, particularly in the area of carbon capture and storage. This really sort of set the stage for the rest of the event and foreshadowed the differing visions countries have on the phase out versus the phase down of fossil fuels.
Yeah, I think the differing visions countries have was certainly on display, and CCS was a controversial topic. So many critics are arguing that discussions around carbon capture are simply a distraction from the necessary conversations around the phase out of fossil fuels. And in direct opposition to Al-Jaber's opening comments, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres urged attendees to focus on a future without fossil fuels and not on nascent technologies. Later in the event, U.S. climate envoy John Kerry said that he believes a combination of phasing out fossil fuels and employing carbon capture technology will be necessary in meeting net zero goals. I also found it interesting that Norway, in its discussions over the final text language, which we'll get into a bit later in our conversation, but Norway said that the country has used CCS for 30 years, but that it should really only be reserved for the most hard to abate sectors like cement and steel.
Another very interesting dynamic was that Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has rarely traveled outside Russia since the country's invasion of Ukraine, managed to make a visit to the UAE, but not necessarily to attend COP events. He was instead visiting the UAE president to discuss Ukraine, Gaza, and of course, oil production. It's also likely that Putin was trying to show that the West's attempts to isolate Russia are not working and to reinforce the country's global influence. While we are on the topic of Russia, the country had been objecting to COP29's location as next year's event was scheduled to be held in Eastern Europe. After much deliberation this year, the climate talks will take place in Azerbaijan. This move immediately drew criticism because of the country's track record on human rights, as well as oil. So we may be having a similar conversation around oil interests again next year.
Well, and the last and probably the most important piece around the fossil fuel interests at this year's COP is in the final event text. So there was lots of division over the language around fossil fuels in the draft text, and deliberations over the final draft language pushed the proceedings past the scheduled event ending. Oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar pushed for looser language around fossil fuel use. On the other hand, the EU was one of the strongest proponents of language cementing a global fossil fuel phase-out. The US was similarly concerned, stating that a text without phase-out language will not come close to keeping the world below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. You also had island nations like Samoa and some other Latin American countries like Colombia agreed with the US and the EU and were really frustrated by the lack of climate action in the draft text. Interestingly, indigenous groups and activists for the Global South pointed out the hypocrisy of rich countries like the US pushing for fossil fuel phase out while continuing to increase production. I also found it interesting, India and China also pointed out that the lack of context in the final text around historical cumulative emissions and the length of time that developed countries have had for peak emissions versus what is now being put forward for developing countries. The UK was also pretty heavily criticized as the country's lead climate negotiator left before the text was finalized. In a quick turnaround, he did return for the unveiling of the final text. And in the end, the final language is kind of a compromise between these two sides, calling for a transition away from fossil fuels over the next decade. So it doesn't go kind of far enough to that direct phase-out language. But interestingly, past COP texts have shied away from specifically mentioning fossil fuels at all and instead referred to emissions reduction. So I still think this agreement can be considered a win for this year's event.
Yeah, on a separate note, there was a new addition at this year's COP. For the first time, the event had a dedicated health day to emphasize the impact of climate change on public health. Some studies shown during the event highlighted that the threat of climate change to human health. The World Health Organization said that climate change will continue to exacerbate existing health threats and challenges, estimating that an additional 250,000 deaths per year will occur in the coming years because of climate change. Climate change will continue to increase the risk of malnutrition, heat stress, as well as tropical diseases, particularly malaria. And a study released just before COP began found that air pollution from fossil fuels is linked to the death of 5 million people a year, which is a pretty startling figure. The inclusion of Health Day was an important development and drew some new funding to help fight climate-driven diseases.
Yeah, that really is a startling figure on the fossil fuel-related air pollution deaths. And I think just given the severity, it seems likely that the focus on health and preventing climate-related deaths will be an important part of future COPs. Outside of health outcomes, there were a few other studies that I found particularly interesting from this year's event. So the World Meteorological Society confirmed that 2023 will be the hottest year on record, replacing the previous record holder, which was 2016. Carbon emissions hit a record high this year and are continuing to grow despite country-level climate commitments. The International Energy Agency said that the current emissions reduction pledges, including those announced at COP, are just not going far enough to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. A new report also found that global climate finance, even after significant growth, is again just still not going far enough to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. So overall, not the most uplifting news, and I think we've probably done a pretty good job of highlighting some of the negative news coming out of COP. But Gordon, were there any positives that you saw?
Yes, there definitely still were some positive developments. Some of the highlights include that the EU and 5 other countries pledged around $400 million for the loss and damage fund that was announced at last year's COP. This funding will go towards the developing countries that will be most hard hit by the increasingly severe effects of climate change. A pledge made to triple global renewable energy capacity by 2030 was signed by 118 countries. 63 countries joined the Global Cooling Pledge, an initiative to cut cooling-related emissions, particularly those coming from air conditioning, which is projected to expand as the world continues to warm, adding a multiplier effect. So the banking sector in the EUAE also committed over $270 billion in sustainable finance funding by 2030, which should help.
I think it's good to highlight some of the progress that was made because I think most of what has really been emphasized, as you mentioned, is really just this deep country level division and frustration over the lack of progress made at the event. Though in the end, we did get nations to agree to transition away from fossil fuels. You also mentioned that Azerbaijan will be hosting next year, so it will be interesting to see if frustrations over the fossil fuel interests present sort of persist into next year. I saw an interesting opinion article in the LA Times that was talking about the future of COP, and the author said that, quote, as deeply flawed as COP is, it's the only existing framework for global climate negotiations, which is really true. So this is really the only climate dedicated event, and these types of climate negotiations are only becoming increasingly necessary. So we will see what the next COP will bring. Thanks so much, Gordon.
You're welcome. As you said, as long as they keep the conversation going, hopefully we can continue to make progress.
Thanks again to Gordon for a very interesting discussion. This concludes our episode. Please email esg@kbra.com with any questions or comments. We also encourage you to visit KBRA's ESG website at esg.kbra.com, where you can find ESG research related to the topics discussed in this episode, further details on KBRA's ESG approach, and other ESG-related media items. You can also join our mailing list to access our ESG Weekly Roundup newsletter.